in this development cooperation strengthening the ASEAN-India partnership. And this is one of the extremely important connects when we talk about the dimension of a partnership, the economic trends that we discussed yesterday, particularly in light of the multilateral engagement and how we are going to go ahead with the idea of turning some of the aspirations, some of the desires and some of the development deficits into a reality. And that brings in development cooperation sharp in focus. This is also about the rise of the South. And rise of the South is in terms of the developing countries providing partnership to the fellow developing countries, coming forward in terms of implementation of the projects. But that's what is the difference between the rich developed countries and the southern developing countries. So this divide between North and South, the divide between the developing countries giving partnership and the developed countries giving assistance. What we see in case of developed countries, the North, it is largely in terms of either the grant element or you have to take the loan. India and many other developing countries have been extending what in India we call as line of credit, but others call it differently, largely loans. What India has evolved in terms of unique development partnership is a sort of commitment for development of the partner countries, what we call as development compact. And this development compact is not just about LOCs. LOCs is an important dimension, but what we have evolved is that LOCs are clubbed with many other development initiatives. So we find that different modalities of engagement, the capacity building, the technology transfer, the access to market, and as you know, in 2008, immediately after in 2005 in WTO Hong Kong ministerial, the demand came from all the developing countries to have a duty-free, quota-free access to the market. So India in 2008 was one of the first few countries to announce this facility for all the LDCs, and they are availing this. At RIS, we have calculated how much market access we have given if we try to monetize that. Those of you who are following the global debates that are happening at the United Nations or at the OECD platforms are fully aware of the fact that this whole narrative from the South of the development cooperation projects is something that we are trying to address. Next year in March in Buenos Aires, the United Nations has called a special General Assembly meeting to mark the 40th year of what is called as BAPA, the Buenos Aires Plan of Action. So 40 years of Buenos Aires of Plan of Action is continuation of what we saw in Bandung in 1954 and then in 1978 in Buenos Aires in terms of our commitment for South-South cooperation. So that is a sort of debate which is coming up in terms of these distinctions in development cooperation and how do we go about it. There are several issues in terms of measurement, in terms of impact assessment, in terms of identifying what kind of development cooperation projects we are implementing and in what way we assess impact of them. In the United Nations and in many other, the last month we had the Development Cooperation Forum of the ECOSOC, and there the demand came up that whatever developing countries are delivering, how to bring in development dimension into it and assess or evaluate. In South-South cooperation, we do not go for what is called as monitoring and evaluation, because who would monitor whom? An evaluation of what? So largely the DFID, the AusAid, the USAID, they have evolved what is called as lock frame approach, and they have evolved methodological frameworks which give you sort of insights in terms of how monetary dimension is to be addressed. What we are saying is that in the southern perspective, the development compact, the theory of development compact gives you convergence of modalities. What is lines of credit? It is, after all, a modality. So combining various modalities together is something that we are trying to address, and that gives the heft that is required in terms of these partnerships. So LOC should not be viewed alone. It should not be viewed as loan alone. It is not a loan. It is not a debt that we are contributing to. What we are contributing to is a capacity of a country to have the breadth that is required in terms of chartering their own development trajectory. As any South-South cooperation, it is a demand-driven process, what the partner country is asking for. And fortunately, along with India, many of the ASEAN countries have also come forward. Thailand, for instance, has already formed what is called as the Thai International Development Agency, TICA. We have in Singapore, there is already a specialized division in their Ministry of Foreign Affairs that deals with South-South cooperation. Indonesia has recently announced setting up of a new agency to deal with development cooperation. And I was discussing with Madam in Philippines, a technical cooperation council under DFA has already been working. In Brunei, they have a small division which responds to specific requests whenever humanitarian assistance is to be provided. So countries are evolving their own mechanisms, and I think ASEAN and India have that way a huge scope in terms of working together on development cooperation. Last week in New York, when some of us were at the HLPF, the high-level political forum, the representatives from Thailand had a huge presentation in terms of how their development cooperation is benefiting the G77 members. So it is important that we realize contribution not in terms of grant, but also in terms of, as I said, all the 5 modalities which form development compact are important. The one other important dimension that I want to mention is in terms of project-based assistance. And those projects are an integral part of the larger narrative on development. And this is important for the developing countries themselves to crystallize and concretize in terms of how they are going ahead with that. Because that gives the strategic autonomy that we require to carve out our own priority for economic development. And it is from that perspective we requested Mr. Rao to join us in this panel, because how the projects are to be exported to other countries, how the big companies that are engaged in this, because after all government has a sort of facilitating role through lines of credit, through other engagements. It's the role of the private sector that would be extremely important. I really wish in one of the following sessions we would have more of the partnership and the presence of our colleagues from ASEAN countries in this panel to bring out this point in terms of how it can be taken further. The project-based assistance is also important in terms of how we bring in, and as the government of India is already doing, and I'm looking forward hearing from Mr. Prashant Agrawal, in terms of how the extra cost is being absorbed by the government of India. So when we say that lines of credit are contributing to the debt burden, it is a huge burden that government of India is absorbing. The interest equalization scheme, when we introduced with the ideas in 2005, that's the milestone year in the evolution of India's own development cooperation partnership. Some of us are also trying to theorize this effort, and we are trying to concretize how the development dimension and how the development finance is to be addressed. As all of us are collectively committed to sustainable development goals, the development finance, particularly the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, is extremely important for the developing countries to capture and move on. fortunately, ASEAN and India are on the same page when it comes to getting into some of these details. Last point is in terms of R&D and technology cooperation. And this is the fifth modality which is of importance. And a case study that I wrote out in terms of India's assistance to Mozambique in providing solar panels is extremely important. And through this solar panel production unit in Mozambique, India could give not only line of credit for production of the solar panels, but also gave technology, got 25 scientists from Mozambique trained here in India for putting the cells in the panel and the angle, etc., on which it should be installed. And this has strengthened the rural electrification program of Mozambique. By all calculations, it is very clear by 2020, Mozambique would emerge as a net exporter of solar panels. So these are the elements of indigeneity which are important to bring in the development cooperation dimension. It is about our commitment for development. It is also about commitment in terms of connecting with the larger dimensions of collective development agenda. So with these words, I once again warmly welcome all of you to this panel. I would first request Mr. David Rasquina, the Managing Director of Exim Bank of India, for his special remarks, maybe for 15 minutes or so. He is a well-accomplished banker and has been dealing with this issue for last almost, 15, 20 years, David, so the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sachin, and it's a pleasure to be here on a panel at the Daily Dialogue, particularly in association with RIS and, of course, Mr. Prashant Agarwal of the MEA and Mr. Rao. Thank you also for those kind words. I should also caution you, ladies and gentlemen, that bankers are, whatever else Sachin might say, we're very boring people. We love numbers and graphs and charts, and I'm going to be throwing a lot of these numbers at you. So I hope that doesn't spoil your appetite for lunch as we go forward. Sachin sketched out a pretty wide range when it comes to cooperation, and indeed over the last day and a half, we've been seeing cooperation in the areas of culture, in security, in communications, and of course, definitely economic relations by way of trade and investment. Trade and investment ultimately are what creates a lasting economic link between the countries and make it a sustainable relationship in the long run, which is based not merely on geography or perhaps on common aims, but a intertwined business sector that can build up these particular links. Now, of course, we can't look at trade and investment in isolation. We need to see where the world economy is growing so that we can come down to the micro level of India and ASEAN. So where is the world going? Fortunately, the bad days following the global crisis have slipped away. Yes, of course, we have a lot of other challenges that came out in the course of the discussions. I'll not go into those right now. But if you look at the economic numbers, growth, which was just about 3.2% for the world as a whole, global GDP, in 2016 has moved up to 3.8% last year. It's expected to go up to 3.9% in the next year. Now, these might look like small changes, but when you're talking of a mass, a critical mass of the size of the global economy, even this change is gigantic. Where is it matter for us here? Trade and investment ultimately are a function of global growth. If the globe is not growing, you cannot logically expect to see trade and investment growing either. And this comes out in the numbers when we look at the way trade and investment is growing. It was growing at a rate of 2.3% in 2016. It more than doubled to 4.9% in 2017. It's likely to touch 5.1% in 2018. So you can see that while the world is growing, trade is growing at a multiple of that. This has been a consistent relationship over the past probably 40, 50 years. It's inverted only 3 times in history: the Great Depression, 9/11, and of course the global financial crisis. So we're clearly on the path to moving up when it comes to trade and investment links. It goes without saying to an Asian audience in this room that the driver of global growth is predominantly in the Asian continent. Asia, that's of course China, but certainly India and the ASEAN region have contributed significantly as drivers of global economic growth and global trade. If you go back to 2017, Let's look at India-ASEAN now that we've talked about the global macro situation. In 2017, the ASEAN countries, if we look at them as a combined one entity, had a combined GDP of 2.8 trillion US dollars. Little more than India at $2.3 trillion. But importantly, if you group ASEAN as one region, they would classify as the 7th largest economy in the world. And going forward, if you project maybe 10, 15 years down the line, ASEAN as a group would be the 4th largest economy in the world. So clearly this has a gigantic potential going forward. Where is this coming from? Now here again you have, of course, a kind of a two-track approach. You have the more advanced countries in the ASEAN grouping, like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and others. You have the CLMV region, which is perhaps a little behind, but is growing much faster and catching up with here. So you have a growth rate ranging from about 6.8% in the CLMV countries, which is significantly higher than the ASEAN as a whole, which is around 5.5%. So a two-track approach is definitely merited because obviously one can't find a cookie-cutter approach to deal with 10 different countries at different stages of development. Where then is our trade and investment going between India and ASEAN if we look at these two regions? The trends are definitely good. There's certainly underlying worries as well. Take a look at the numbers first of all. In 2007-8, 10 years ago, global financial crisis, etc., India's trade with ASEAN, the total trade, bilateral trade, was $39 billion. In 2017-18, last year, 10 years later, it had doubled to $81.3 billion. So that's good. Doubling is always nice. Doubling over 10 years, not all that great. But if you factor in the part that for a significant part of this decade, the world was in the throes of the financial crisis, I think you can agree that this has been a pretty decent performance. If we look at exports, and being the Exim Bank of India, you'll forgive me for focusing specifically on exports from India. That's my job and I have to earn my daily salary after all. Indian exports were about $16 billion in the start of this decade. It had more than doubled to $34.2 billion at the end of this decade. So pretty much in pace. Indian imports also moved from about $22 billion to $47 billion. This all is the good news. But now if you take a look at what is the percentage of India's total trade to the overall, we are barely around the 10% in terms of imports. That is about 10% of India's total imports come from the ASEAN region and about 12 to 13% of India's exports go to the ASEAN region. Now, this doesn't look quite so good. Doubling may be fine and the years have not been so great, but if it is this small a proportion, then clearly we have a long way to go. The positive side, of course, is that one can only go up from here and not go backwards. Let's not look only at trade. Trade creates a transactional relationship, especially in commodities, less so in projects. But it is investment which creates lasting economic benefit, which can lead to a building of knowledge here. So India's investments in the ASEAN region have been significant. They've been driven by high growth markets, which are very much there in ASEAN, low wage, natural resources. A lot of India's outward FDI into ASEAN, interestingly, if you look at it, is towards the coal, oil, and natural gas sector. But importantly, there is a lot of it in services, in software, in education, in medical. So there is an interesting bifurcation of high value and low value in terms of India's investment out. Now clearly the ASEAN is a hot growth spot for the world economy. And as the ASEAN implements the Comprehensive Investment Agreement, the Economic Community Scorecard, and the AEC Blueprint, this can only go further as we go forward. This is where India's growth in high value-added production and manufacturing, with increasing import demand in ASEAN for both products as well as technology, can be a win-win situation for both the India as well as the ASEAN economic grouping. And naturally, this will help to strengthen the bilateral ties which look at other interests other than economic and trade as we go forward. Which are these potential areas? At Exim Bank, we've taken a look at this, and some of the sectors are the digital industry, which is perhaps the fastest growing in the world right now, financial services, which are a significantly underserved area, particularly in some of the countries, physical infrastructure, particularly for multimodal commodity and shipments. We heard about the road networks and the shipping networks over the last day and a half, agriculture, healthcare and tourism, again, which we've been talking about, so I'm not going to go further into these. Now, where exactly does Exim Bank come into the picture on these? I'll not spend too much time on this because I'm sure Mr. Agarwal would be giving you the Government of India's position. I would like to talk about a public sector and a private sector approach. On the public sector approach, Exim Bank is privileged to be the agency of the Government of India in the lines of credit that Professor Sachin mentioned at the beginning. These lines of credit are facilities which are approved by the Government of India to countries for development projects. I'm sure Prashant Agrawal will talk more about that, so I'll not stress on it. But at Exim, we have the privilege of being the agent or the instrumentality of the government in managing and administering this program. Different countries have different models. Korea, for example, has the OECF as an independent balance sheet which manages it. Japan has the JBIC and JICA. Other countries have a different model. India is perhaps unique in that we have the government through the Ministries of External Affairs and Finance, and you also have a 100% government-owned entity. So that gives you the flexibility of the government staying out of the commercial areas, leaving the commercial areas to a financial institution which is best placed to handle it, but maintaining a close control over the entire program, directing the program and clearly setting the priorities for it, which can then be implemented and administered by the financial institution. And given that the institution is also owned by the Government of India, effectively you have a closed loop of multiple benefits. In the lines of credit right now, as of June 30th, we have about 22 lines of credit with credit commitments of just under $1 billion, 951 if you want to quibble, for financing exports to 4 countries in the ASEAN region. Why 4 countries? As I said, there is a 2-track approach. The more advanced countries in the ASEAN region do not really need to look at a credit facility. They're looking more at investment linkages, whereas the other countries would find it beneficial to use it under the lines. What have these lines been used for? Hydropower projects, electricity transmission, upgradation of railway systems, plant and manufacturing, textile machinery. Something I'm particularly proud of is a project in Myanmar. This is where a plant has been set up for heavy turbo truck manufacturing. And interestingly, 60% of the staffing of this particular factory is women. Now, I'm sorry to sound rather like a male chauvinist, but you don't normally associate women and heavy trucks. The mind somewhat jars. So this has been an extremely interesting project and something we are particularly happy about to break a stereotype and contribute to development in Myanmar. Apart from this, the government has also set up a project development fund for the CLMV countries, that is Cambodia, Laos PDR, Myanmar and Vietnam, with an initial commitment of 500 crore, which is roughly about $77 million in US dollars. And this fund is to be used for supporting regional value chain projects, which will integrate Indian companies into the regional value chain and bind the commercial sectors of the countries closer together. We've identified a number of possible projects in these particular countries through monitoring missions and through public missions. And currently, investments in the healthcare sector in Cambodia, Myanmar and Vietnam, and the educational sector in Myanmar are moving ahead. This is where, in some ways, it is rather interesting to see that in India, the government has led and the private sector has followed. Normally, you would expect that in frontier markets, the private sector has an increasing appetite for reasons which are not entirely clear. Perhaps the stress on private sector balance sheets in India, the private sector has been the follower and the government has been the leader. But I think a lot of kudos to the government for recognizing this and leading the way. Exim has also been looking at financing project exports. One of my most pleasant memories, perhaps about, again, around 10 years ago, when I was looking after project exports, was when one of our railway companies secured a project in Malaysia. Why was it special? That was the first time an Indian project exporter had secured a project against international competition for $1 billion. At that time, $1 billion was a large amount, and we had a small party in the bank when that happened because it was the first time we'd financed a $1 billion project. Now, of course, that $1 billion is not such a big number anymore, but it was an interesting railway project linking Seremban and Gemas in Malaysia. We've moved upmarket from them, financing floating point and storage vessels in Indonesia, transmission lines, and so on. There is also the buyer's credit program under the Ministry of Commerce, which allows as a kind of a hybrid between the government orientation of the lines of credit and the private sector orientation. This allows for shorter credit periods, not quite so attractive commercial terms, but quicker turnaround because of the private sector orientation of this particular project. Interestingly, 2 of our overseas offices, we have 9 overseas offices in all, and 2 of them are in the ASEAN countries, in Yangon in Myanmar and in Singapore to be precise. We've been also working on capacity building. We are a member of the Asian Exim Banks Forum, And I'm very happy that all the ASEAN countries are represented either through their actual Exim Banks or as observer countries which are looking at setting up Exim Banks at some point in the future. We've been providing this kind of expertise for developing a national export strategy that was in Myanmar. We did the initial feasibility for setting up the Exim Bank of Malaysia several years ago. We've also been looking at designing export marketing training for small and medium enterprises in Vietnam. Why? It's just that we've had the experience of doing that. We were set up back in the 1980s. We worked our way through India's liberalization from the old periods of autarky to the open economy of today. So we've learned a lot of lessons along the way, and we're more than happy to share these lessons with others. Importantly, and before I end this quick address, let me focus briefly on investment as well. We are looking at ultimately reaching a target of $200 billion in terms of mutual investment in the course of the next 15 to 20 years. So where have we reached on these numbers so far? And interestingly, the numbers are almost exactly identical. Investment from ASEAN into India has been running in the region of $77 to $78 billion cumulatively over the last 10 years. From India into ASEAN, it has been at around $84 billion. If you look at the near equality of the GDP, clearly these are links which are steady going forward, and we'd like to see these links building up further as we go forward. So to end quickly, the lines of credit are working well. The two-stage approach looks at the lines of credit for the CLMV countries, investment for the other more advanced countries. Those investments are doing well. To give you examples, they are in education, they are in hospitals, they are in chemicals, they are in textiles, they are in steel wire ropes. There's a range of possible goods. Setting up of joint ventures using Singapore jurisdiction has become extremely popular. We're seeing an increasing trend on arbitration out of Singapore for legal agreements which are coming there going forward. And we're seeing this as across the line. Where are the trouble spots? Well, corporate balance sheets in India still need to be strengthened a little bit. We'd like to see the private sector taking a bigger lead rather than just following the government. But overall, things are looking good, and we see this as growing faster going forward. Let me stop at this point because I would be more happy to look at a dialogue and taking questions from the audience. But let me stop at this point with a quick overview of what we're doing, and then I'll wait for the next. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I think it was quite important and full with insights in terms of distinguishing the structure within ASEAN. And as you know, India has supported the third pillar within the ASEAN, and we have this sort of approached CLMV countries in a different manner, and the rest of the mainstream countries in another form. And you are absolutely right that the project exports and partnership of the firms for the countries which are advanced in economic development in a different manner, and lines of credit and other instruments for the CLMV countries. That I think is extremely important. It is also important that we bring out the differences between the projects that are being implemented, both for connectivity. Just in the last session, we heard about connectivity for what? And that I think is an important question. Connectivity for local livelihood security, connectivity for embedding the local development model where countries can excel in terms of their own production, and the lines of credit projects both in Myanmar and also you mentioned Laos. They have strengthened the entrepreneurial base which is required. Later in the second session, we would have Dr. Shukla here, who would be talking about the entrepreneurial efforts that are being made by India with the Entrepreneurship Development Institute. So India, Laos Entrepreneurship Development Institute, India, Cambodia Entrepreneurship Development Institute. So it is extremely important that lines of credit and the financing that you mentioned is backed by that strength of the local development. So the global connectivity projects which are coming up would have to be examined in terms of how they are contributing to this local livelihood security. It is not just imports of products from other regions. It is important that the local production architecture is structured. And this is why we call this more as development compact. It is our commitment for the development of the region and of the people. So thanks a lot for this very substantive intervention. I look forward later for the Q&A. But now let me turn to Joint Secretary in our Development Partnership Administration. And those of you who are not aware of DPA, I'm sure Prashant would be telling you about what DPA stands for and what's its focus. But in the program, you might have seen DPA 1. So I would request him to also elaborate that. So Mr. Prashant Agrawal, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sachin, and a very good morning to all of you. Sachin, when you mentioned about the development compact, I think you just gave me the perfect springboard to, jumpstart my own conversation with this very distinguished audience today. Because indeed, the South-South cooperation has been the binding philosophy of our own development cooperation approach. Goes back to the ideals of our freedom struggle and, this ideal to develop together, to grow together, that's been the binding philosophy. With ASEAN, we are marking 25 years of our partnership with ASEAN as a group, but bilaterally with each and every one of the ASEAN member countries, we have very strong relationships. So I would like to make 5 broad points today. And the first point is that, our development cooperation, our development partnership as we call it, is very strongly rooted in our partner countries' national needs, their priorities, and it is completely demand driven. The partner countries take ownership of what they want and what they want to execute, and we are there just to extend a hand of cooperation to them. So in India, very proud of this approach and this strategy. The second point I would like to make is the division of labor. Development cooperation has many important elements, and I would broadly delineate these in 3 elements. One would be the element of capacity building. The second element would be the cooperation through grants. And the third one I would call it as concessional credit, which personally I deal with. So as Sachin was asking as to what this development partnership administration is all about, in India's Ministry of External Affairs, we have this demarcation of work, whereas Development Partnership Administration 1, which is me and my colleagues, we look after concessional credit. The DPA 2 looks after all our capacity building programs, and I recognize my very distinguished colleague, Mr. Dinkar Asthana, who handles that part. So if there are questions on capacity building, I'm going to safely pass it on to him. And our DPA 3 looks after our grant projects, the major grant projects largely in our neighborhood. So coming back to the capacity building part, this is a very important element of, skill building and, building capacities in our partner countries. And we have our flagship ITEC program, the Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Program, which has been, there since 60s. So it has just completed 53 very successful years, and there have been thousands of experts from our partner countries trained in a very large number of areas. So what we do is we rely on the network of institutions of excellence which are in India to provide very customized, tailor-made training as per the needs to our partner countries. And these capacity buildings, I mean, you name it, and we provide training in those areas. But I would mention a few which have been more important from the ASEAN perspective, and these are in the areas of ICT, English language, entrepreneurship, management, leadership, banking, finance, health. And whenever there is a request for customized training, we are very happy to do that. For ASEAN, we offer almost 900 to 1,000 slots every year. The slots can be increased on the basis of demand. And my colleague, Mr. Asthana, is undertaking a very thorough review of our current program to make it future-oriented. So, to look at needs of, artificial intelligence or Industry 4, wherever you need, courses and training for modernization, we are looking at those aspects as well. The second part I would like to sort of bring to your notice is about the cooperation through grants. And just continuing our approach of providing training in India, we also set up institutions under our grant program in our partner countries where these institutions actually train, a much larger number. So the programs in India are essentially, training the trainers, but these institutions which are right there in these countries, and I am of course looking at CLMV countries, as a primary focus. So be it vocational centers, the ICT centers, agricultural research and education centers, industrial training centers, you name it, and we have set these up. Just to give you an example of Myanmar, in Myanmar we have the Institute of ICT, there's a Rice Biopark, hospitals, police training center. So even under our grant program, capacity building remains, has and receives a very strong emphasis. The second element of grant programs looks at overall economic development through infrastructure building and connectivity. So projects such as the trilateral highway network, which connects, which would be connecting India through Myanmar and eventually to Thailand. And I recognize Ambassador Pradap, who has been working on this project for some time. The project is likely to be completed in the next couple of years. It has suffered some time delays because of technical challenges in some stretches inside Myanmar, but would eventually be providing an extension to rest of Southeast Asia as well. But besides the road connectivity, and I recognize the theme is maritime connectivity, we are also looking at coastal shipping opportunities, through networks such as ASEAN and BIMSTEC. So where the technical challenges are that much more or less. There are projects such as the Kaladan multimodal network, which again is a flagship connectivity initiative. There are grant projects in the space of culture and heritage. So either we are talking about restoration of the Bagan temple complex in Myanmar or the charm monuments in Vietnam. This also remains an important element of grant-based cooperation. Besides that, through ASEAN as an institution and through ASEAN Secretariat, we have some instrumentalities at our disposal. I'm talking about the ASEAN India Fund, which was set up with a 50 million corpus, which has been enhanced by another 50 million 2 years ago. The India ASEAN Green Fund, the India ASEAN Science and Technology Fund, they are all available for projects. And we also look at our partnership through the mechanism of the Mekong-Ganga cooperation. The next element of cooperation with which I personally deal with is our lines of credit program. So we started with our own concessional credit program only about, I would say, 13 years ago. So in that short period of time, we have expanded our outreach, or our LOC program now extends to 61 countries across the globe. And our commitments have totaled nearly about $25 billion under our LOCs. For ASEAN, Mr. David Raskina, and we work very closely with Exim Bank. You would have seen that probably India's own, we don't have a specific development cooperation agency, but we have a very strong focus on that. It's a somewhat amorphous entity which extends from MEA to Exim Bank to our finance ministry. So these three institutions essentially the development cooperation strategies. So in ASEAN, we have extended a large number of lines of credit and some very successful programs. David spoke about the truck assembly plant in Myanmar, but there have been optical fiber cable connections, railways, renovation of refineries, microwave links. I specifically refer to projects in Cambodia such as the Krati Strungtang, electricity transmission line, the Stung Swahap water project, and in Vietnam, the Binh Ho pumping station, which we are going to be inaugurating shortly. So in our LOCs, there is a streamlined procedure at place. Let me just make two brief points on the LOCs. At times, we have heard from our partners that this entire LOC process looks a little daunting to us. Now, we do take that point. As I've told you that, we have also been on a learning curve of our own. And the streamlining of these procedures has been a constant endeavor. And I can say this with a great deal of satisfaction that we now have a system which allows everyone to move forward very quickly. I'll just give you one example. In case of Bangladesh, we did a major line of credit of $4.5 billion last year. And for some of those infrastructure projects, we are going to be reaching the tendering stage in next couple of months. So it is possible to move quickly forward. In fact, just before this session, I was discussing with David, and we have been able to sort of further shorten some of the processes in finalizing an LOC agreement. The other point I would like to mention in the LOCs is this word called opportunities. I think the opportunities are immense because, our Indian companies, and we will have the private sector perspective shortly, the Indian companies, of which GMR is a very good example, have developed their expertise over a very wide range of sectors. So be it irrigation, be it transmission, be it power generation, be it supply of equipment, be it solar energy, looking at the new areas, be it health sector. They are there, and as per the partner country's needs, we can quickly develop the projects. So it allows our companies to also sort of capitalize these opportunities, but they invariably partner with local companies. So it's to use a cliche, this is a win-win situation. My last point is about again about capacity and capacity augmentation. So in some cases we realized that in partner countries they had a felt need to develop a project. So let's say in a remote location you wanted to develop a solar power project or so on, but they didn't really have the know-how of how to proceed, or a resource crunch, which is often the case in case of developing countries. So we have very recently set up a mechanism called a project preparation facility. Now similar PPFs exist by, are already in play by organizations like World Bank and ADB and so. But our PPF is somewhat different from these mechanisms. Normally the multilateral institutions extend, financial support to take a project. But we have gone a step ahead and we actually offer consultancy support, which is free of cost. So if a country has a need and all it needs to is to sort of enunciate that need on a one page, that's it. There's nothing more required. And in a matter of, let's say, about 6 weeks, we are able to sort of select and identify a good consultancy firm which can sort of develop the feasibility study of that project, and there can be boots in the ground in a matter of a few weeks. So we launched this in January. It has met with a huge success. I mean, we are inundated with proposals, so we are very happy with that. So if there are such projects, and I refer to colleagues from ASEAN countries in this room, we'll be very happy to take these requests on board as well. The requests can come to us, to ASEAN Secretariat, to Exim Bank, whichever way. I mean, it's the end which is important. So I'll stop here by flagging your attention to these 5 points, and we can come back during discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Prashant. I think this was quite helpful and again full with details. I'm grateful to you that you also mentioned about how the project preparation facility has been created. And this is one important contribution. India has been grappling with this challenge of delays in projects. And sometimes we do not know how these delays are happening. There are a couple of projects which were mentioned yesterday here in Delhi Dialogue, and I think it's important that particularly with countries like Myanmar, with others, we need to see how infrastructure projects are quickly implemented. So one important limitation that we see is in terms of how projects are envisaged and conceptualized. So at that stage, hand-holding is extremely important. The first point that you made in terms of what the DPA is, I think is extremely important for us to understand. And if we go back in history, it was way back in 1952 that India had what was called as India Aid Mission. And this India Aid Mission was established in Nepal. It was only in 1966 when Mrs. Indira Gandhi went there to Nepal, it was changed from India Aid Mission to India Cooperation Mission. Because Mrs. Gandhi very clearly said, and this then became our policy, that India doesn't give aid. We do not provide aid. We are your development partner, and we would call this as India Cooperation Mission. And since then, the policy has evolved in a major way on how partnerships are crafted. It was, again, you go back in 1946, when Pandit Nehru proposed it to Viceroy, that we should get people here at Indian Agriculture Research Institute in Pusa for training in agriculture sector. And Viceroy turned it down because it was an interim government. But through the education minister, Nehru prevailed, and we got 25 candidates from Indonesia and 15 candidates from China in 1946, I'm talking of, for training here in India. And that was the beginning of our development cooperation capacity building program. Malaysia joined us in 1951 when we launched the Colombo Plan. And if you see, 1948, Myanmar was the first country from the sterling balance that we gave what now we call as IDEAS program and line of credit. So history tells us that how consistent Shankari was mentioning in terms of strategic affairs, the 25 years consistency. But our partnership, our commitment for development cooperation has been there from pre-independence era. And that has been the strength and the heft that the foreign policy of this country requires, and the expectation of the partner countries in terms of we stabilizing the development process both within India and of course outside India is very much reflection of what Prime Minister now says of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. So you bring in that connect again on the table in terms of the idea of one world, and what External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj in the BRICS summit described as idea of the one family, one big family. So that I think is important. It goes beyond commercial interest, it goes beyond trade interest, it goes far beyond the project facilities. Now I would be turning to Mr. Rao, who brings in this idea of private sector participation and commercial earnings, because the companies would like, of course, to their own shareholders to be fair in terms of commercial earnings, which is not bad, but I think that commitment that India brings in terms of project conception, and as Mr. David mentioned, in terms of we bringing in that multi-country project conception, both for infrastructure deficit and also in terms of providing the necessary connect with the development deficit that we are seeing. So, Mr. Rao, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Sachin. Colleagues on dais, David, Prashant, and ladies and gentlemen. Yesterday and today I was participating. I think we private players are little odd in this forum. Mostly it is a forum of policy makers, people with a large academic background, think very long for the benefit of the society and the member countries of ASEAN. I could hardly met 1-2 people only who are into these companies like us. While it is so, we as a leading private company in infrastructure projects, PPP projects, we call public-private participation. We keep working with large organizations like RIS and many policy-making institutes to develop various models of public projects. In this process, I was debating with Professor Sachin, sir, ASEAN is on a very highly political, or it is formed as a regional balancing economic platform. How as a private company could come into this debate, but it is interesting to observe from outside. But he was very keen. You know, you have developed many projects beyond India. I think your experience should be shared with the members so that it will give a different perspective of the development or cooperation, economic cooperation. Thank you for the guidance, Sachin, once again. See, while you are all experts of how this Asian philosophy has come, and you have been continuously engaged from each region for the economic cooperation or cultural ties, and develop a strategic relationship of all member countries. I am observing from outside how the private entrepreneurs can bring in, fulfilling the gaps between governments, policymakers, or the projects to such benefit the society. See, what we as a private companies, I feel, one is public-private investment has to be there for any growth platforms. Yes, governments, public agencies come up with policy making, bring in platforms. As Sachin was explaining, if there is a region which needs certain things and they are lacking skills to implement or identify how to do that, the development agencies can step in, identify the platforms, people, consultants, or sometimes the developers. So we also, if 91, the first economic reform started under the leadership of Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, then Manmohan Singh Ji, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, now it is Modi. So in 91, 92, I think Look East policy has started. How this region can become one economic power. Then slowly it has now developed under Modi's regime. Act East, earlier we are looking, planning and all, now let us stand up, act and concentrate on projects. Yesterday also there was debate, some of the members were talking about there are certain projects, 18 years, 20 years, are we going to see the light? But there was assurances from other stakeholders that the regions, the members are very serious in finding solutions to come up. So I feel that private entrepreneurs can bring in the gaps which is leading to delays or fulfilling any gaps which is stopping or which is slowing the system, whether it is by capital, private capital can step in. Then public funding, yes, you bring a lot of credentials as governments, but yes, the lending agencies, whether it is IMF or any local banks or any development banks like Exim banks, they are look to the success of the project also, without delays, without cost overruns. I think these are the areas where we can come in and fill this gap so that the dream of these nations, these member countries, the people, shall fulfill in integrating our connectivity between these regions so that the economic transformation which was planned can be delivered. This is what I think where public private companies can step in. Especially some of the projects when we are looking like Kaldam multimodal transport project, India-Myanmar trilateral project, Ritidim road project, border hats. These are large projects connecting different parts of these regions. Many of you are aware of these things, but how to make it happen? Probably companies like GMR or many companies are there in each region, each country. We have the experience of working and learning, working and implementing. For example, when we bidded for Hyderabad airport, first privatization of Greenfield airport in India, we have partnered with Malaysian airports. Malaysian airports are our partner from those days till every airport project. We have completed 5 airport projects within India and outside the world. They are our partners. We have been a continuous learning because always regional partnerships can bring in costs very efficiently because we use regional skills, regional labor, and cultural values and cultural architectural designs which suits our local material, local needs, so that the costs are optimized. But at the same time, companies like us who can bring in international experience by partnering with appropriate regions, that there will be an international standards of services. We can deliver the best value-added services to the regions, to the public. This is how this blend of international as well as local partnering, local manpower, local cultural designs, these things can bring in value-added services. For example, you might have all experienced Delhi airport when you landed in Delhi. Delhi airport was built by us in a record period of 37 months. Obviously, many projects of this nature was almost 50 months plus. Even Shanghai airport, the Chinese team has visited us to understand how GMR can make such a large 50 million capability terminal and runway within 37 months. Of course, it's all mutual learnings. I should credit that the government of India at that time has formed a cross-functional team building an airport. 37 ministries or 37 departments we have to work in. But the government recognized that the project has to see the light for the Commonwealth Games. They formed a national committee where all secretaries of India are partners, and every month CAPSEC is to review and thrash out the program. That is how it happened. I don't say that GMR has done it. It is the commitment and conviction of the government and the bureaucracy I should compliment. They have committed. That is how it can be delivered. So the cooperation between people, government, and private skills always can deliver best of the projects. We as GMR, we have developed outside in Turkey, we have developed an airport. Maldives, we have developed an airport. Now we have just completed in Cebu, Philippines, a new airport, new terminal on June 7th. The president has complimented that GMR shall get every airport in Philippines for moderation. It was built as a regional, it is a platform to exhibit the regional culture, and the government at that time has said that it should be a resort airport. This is what was defined. The government was so happy because Cebu is one of the largest outsourcing hub, and people, tourism, people they should experience. This is what makes the difference in delivering large public projects. I think this is where private companies, I don't say ABC, I just given my experience, but many companies are there. But in this region, especially large companies are there within every country also, but local partnering and an international expertise will always make a difference. That is my experience. And yesterday when I was in one of the session, one of the speaker was mentioning about project HERA defined by Prime Minister Modi to how Northeast countries region can become a web of platform for development with Asia. When HERA they said highways, railways, airways. We as GMR, we are almost there, like we are in highways, we are in railways, we are in airports. We are not in highways, but our airports will give you 100% experience of technology, whether it is in check-in without any manual intervention, online boarding processing, and we are continuously engaging with the air traffic system through NATs and other countries so that the technology can improve the capability of the airports. For example, we work very closely with the Airport Authority of India and NATS London, how we can use the airport with same investment, how a capacity can be enhanced, how the separation between an aircrafts. Earlier, it is large separation, but slowly technology and commitment and training to the people has helped us to increase the airport capacity by 10%. This is how we all can make things. This is where I feel these private companies we can come up. And as GMR, we are working in other projects also. We are developing a large hydropower plant in Nepal. With our experience, we work with all these development agencies, how the projects can be stitched bankable. This is how our skills can bring in. For example, many years, Nepal has been a country with almost 1 lakh megawatts of hydropower can be developed. But hardly the capital, Kathmandu, will have almost 8 hours power cut. Because how the projects, large projects, especially it is continental, like they cannot supply, they cannot consume such power. But if we worked with the government of India, we worked with government of Nepal, then IMF and other company, bilateral agencies to develop the project model as well as the transmission corridors. It is a tremendous work has happened, but the agencies always feel that we can bring in the element of cost recovery and reasonable profiting. All public-private partnerships should be designed in such a way that because there are large 25, 30, 50, 60 years projects. They should get the long-term finances by different methodologies. Second is, there should be a win-win situation. Either the private entrepreneur should not charge or recover the value from the users, passengers, or whether it is power consumers, or whether it is tolling projects. So the charges shall be reasonable, but at the same time, if there is an absolute, I should say, charging high or earning, then there should be contracts should be in such a way that we can moderate. The owner agency can step in and they can lessen the concession periods or reduce the charges. Sometimes these projects go beyond their estimates. The project runs difficulties. There should be a situation that the government should recognize that the projects are suffering so that it should be appropriately revisited, like extend the concession period. So economic viability, reasonable returns should be the model rather than I win, you lose, or you lose, I win. I think it should be win-win projects. This is where experienced PPP projects developers can bring in value, avoiding any possible litigations at a later period, and also attract the large funding from development agencies by defining economic viability by appropriate risk allocation. I think these are certain platforms where we can bring in these things. Yes, as either the banks or lenders, everybody is aware of it. But practically making it happen will make sense. Many airports, many countries, we have almost 3, 4 other countries also are working. We work with the governments also, how regulations in each region can mature, because the regulations in India may not definitely help in other regions. But blend of certain learnings can always help it. With this possibility, we look for many opportunities for local partnering and participating in the projects in Asian region. And thank you, Professor Sachin, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, friends.
Thanks, Mr. Rao, for bringing out so many very important points. Friends, we are running out of time now. Like my predecessor, Commodore Bhaskar Rao, I would like to give floor first to our guests from ASEAN countries, if they have any observation, and then I would turn to my colleagues. So, from India, do I see anyone from ASEAN region interested in taking floor now? Anybody from ASEAN? PT, you want to raise some point? Ambassador, yes, please.
I will speak from a private sector point of view.
Yeah.
As a senior advisor of the largest integrated engineering consultancy in Thailand. And we're looking forward to establish a sort of a strategic partnership with all countries in ASEAN and of course in India. And I think the theater does have to be in the ASEAN or India itself. It could be in a third country. Mr. Rao, the chairman, mentioned about Nepal. We try to build hydropower with the Nepalese, fail. So maybe we could join hands with you and see where we could do in Nepal, Bhutan, or even in other countries in ASEAN. So I think with my good friend Pachan, I think they could be the facilitator, because sometimes, with the seed money, you could do some kind of initial study that bring us together. And if we don't have enough money, we can always go to Exim Bank. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, let me thank all the panelists for their excellent presentations. And I must also congratulate the Ministry of External Affairs, particularly carrying the flag, the DPA, for its development cooperation, both philosophy and its implementation. I think it's been a great success. My question actually is going to touch on the LOCs. I think we should probably acknowledge that while the LOCs, government-to-government LOCs, play a very important role in building relations and also in helping the development of those countries, led by the government itself, I think there are certain limitations in the extent to which they actually open up markets. And my question is really, why can we not have much more facilities for buyer's credit, seller's credit, and risk insurance, particularly for small and medium enterprises, based on the local economies of the region, which is basically rooted in agri, horti, fisheries, forests, and livestock, and use that as the strategic backbone for building our kind of economic connectivity, utilizing our various corridors and highways that we are developing, particularly between the Northeast through the CMLMV right up to Vietnam. So why is the buyers, sellers, and risk insurance package not better developed? Because I feel that in terms of market opening, in terms of utilizing the DFDP, in terms of being able to exploit the opportunities of the ASEAN common market in future, we need to have much more proactive investment policy directed to a certain extent towards the SMEs who actually find it difficult to raise finances, and particularly focused on the agri-horti sector.
Thank you, sir. Prabir, as I promised, I would close it in 1 hour. I'm left with 3 minutes, and there are 3 hands at the end, so I would just go there. 1 minute each. I would start first with Sandhya. So Sandhya, just half a minute.
Thanks. I think 20 seconds is good for me. I just wanted to raise this concern that since we are taking the development compact approach, I think all the 3 forms of DPA need to converge to address cross-border SDG issues, particularly because we are finding the movement of, the migration of workers across borders, the nature of development and deprivation that we have just been looking at, particularly from our institute. The conditions are appalling. So I think we need to bring this perspective into the development.
Excellent.
compact.
Thank you. Professor Rao. And then Mr. Singh.
Yeah, very half second would be enough for me, Mr. Chairman. That excellent presentation on the involvement of the GMR on the Nepali hydel projects. I do know, sir. But if you look into the past, in Nepal there had been certain sensitivities about involving the Indian companies, not only in the hydel projects, in generally on their water development plan, Kosi, Gandak, Pancheshwar, etc. Now, if we want to know if you have any constraints in going ahead, or you are easy enough to complete your project over there. Because if your project is really going to be well taken by the local people and the government, that also extends potentiality of exploring further the 1 lakh and so megawatts available in Nepal to open a regional grid, and so where India can be an important player in sharing that power to the northeastern country. There was a proposal sometime back. Yeah. We want to know from your experiences how successful you have been in trying to execute your project on hydel project in Nepal. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Rao. Mr. Singh, just half a second. Commerce Secretary is already waiting outside, so we have to
the question
close
is
it.
to Mr. Agrawal.
Yes.
The Prime Minister announced 1 billion rand of credit for ASEAN. So how many proposals have you received? Last time you had not received none. 0, and what are the reasons behind it? Same question is to Mr. Rakushin, Mr. David. You can also, why there is no proposal for the 1 billion rand of credit of ASEAN by the Prime Minister?
You want to? Okay. So can you make a quick response?
No, I think since the one question towards the end, which is directed about the 1 billion LOC, as I mentioned, these are demand driven. So the offer is on the table. It is for the countries to come up with the offer. But I recognize there have been 2 issues. One is that we understand that in ASEAN countries, the telecom sector is largely in the hand of private players. The other challenge which we have faced is in case of some countries, the question of sovereign guarantee has been an issue. But I'm happy to report that in case of Myanmar, for example, we have a large number of telecom projects on which we are working. Thank you.
Thank you. Just half a second for you, David. I'm sorry.
Half a second. Thank you, sir, for your help while you were ambassador in Yangon. To answer your question very crisply, there is a flaw in the institutional mechanism in India for term export credit and term export insurance. The ECGC, which does a very good job, the bulk of its cover is short term, because in the long term, they come under the regulation of IRIDA. And IRIDA does not allow a cover in a foreign currency. Now, no investor, no private sector or public sector investor will take a 5 or a 7-year risk with a rupee cover, knowing that they held an open exchange position. Their shareholders won't allow it. The board of directors won't allow it. I suspect the RBI would have doubts. The same thing with the Exim Bank. We come under the regulation of the Reserve Bank of India. We are regulated on par with the commercial banks. We need to relook at that architecture, sir.
Colleagues, we would have to close this session. My apologies, I could not give floor to everyone. I think we had very rich discussion. The panel was extremely fantastic in terms of covering the larger issues and of course the specific details on development cooperation projects, modalities of engagement. One dimension that we could not bring in here, private sector of course was there, is the role of the civil society. And that I think is extremely important for all of us. All of us are democracies, and for democratic establishment, voice of people is extremely important. They are our watchdog. They are our partners in this journey on economic development. I wish we could have captured that. And as I said right in the beginning, we could have had some participation from ASEAN countries. So Professor Prabir Dey, in the next Delhi Dialogue in Development Cooperation panel, we should get a couple of more participants from ASEAN countries in this panel. With these words, I close, and I would like to give a big hand to my panel for this excellent session. Thank you. Thanks a lot.